Hi, folks. I'm Greg McLawsen, the Affidavit of Support lawyer. I help green card holders enforce the Affidavit of Support in federal lawsuits, and I serve as a consulting and testifying expert in family law cases when the Affidavit of Support is enforced in a divorce proceeding. Today, can you enforce the Affidavit of Support if you don't actually have a copy of the document? Short answer, yes. And in fact, this happens absolutely all the time. I would say in the vast majority of cases, 90% of folks who come to me to enforce the Affidavit of Support don't have a copy of the document. Why would that be? Well, think about how consular cases work. Your US citizen spouse has filed the I-130 petition, that got approved. You're ready to go through the consular processing of your visa application. All of the material that goes to the National Visa Center, so this is what includes the Affidavit of Support, is typically filed by the US citizen or their attorney, usually before the foreign national has a chance to see it. It goes straight from the US citizen to the National Visa Center, and from there it goes to the consulate. So the foreign national at no point has touched the Affidavit of Support, and they're just not going to have a copy for their record. So when that person then goes off and becomes a US citizen, they have their green card, but they just don't have the Affidavit of Support because they never had a reason to have it in the first place. Can that person then, 2 years later, when the marriage has fallen apart and the person needs to rely on the Affidavit of Support for financial resources, can that person then enforce the affidavit even though they don't have the document? Yes, and here are a couple different ways of how that works. First of all, you can get a copy of the Affidavit of Support through the Freedom of Information Act. So FOIA requests, as they are called, can be filed online with USCIS. You can file the request by email using a G639. That is done with a ink signature. Don't forget that. You have to actually print the FOIA form, sign it, and then email it to USCIS. You can also sign up for a free account at USCIS FOIA website and submit an online request there. You can actually authenticate your identity using a cell phone number, so you never have to touch paper. That's very convenient. That's typically how we do it at the law firm now. Those requests typically take about 45 days. Processing times go up and down. I know people will say the government has to respond in 20 days to FOIA requests. It's actually more complicated than that. Again, in reality, they take about 45 days, but you will eventually get it. You want to request your alien file, which is a complete copy of what you have with USCIS. Notably, sometimes the FOIA request will come back with redactions on the Affidavit of Support. We see this in maybe 5 to 10% of cases that we file. That is because of something called the Privacy Act, which governs the privacy of information for US citizens. Yes, USCIS is inconsistent with how they apply Privacy Act protections, but I'm just telling you as somebody who files a lot of FOIA requests that sometimes it comes back with partial redaction on the Affidavit of Support. Usually this is the financial information of the sponsor. But one way or the other, typically the FOIA will come back with enough information intact on the Affidavit of Support that you can certainly demonstrate that the affidavit was signed by the sponsor. In addition to FOIA requests, the regulations around the Affidavit of Support at 8 CFR 213A dot 2, I believe it is, dot 4, specifically provide for subpoena power. What this means is that once a lawsuit is started against an Affidavit of Support sponsor, the plaintiff has the ability to issue a subpoena to USCIS. Having done this, I will tell you what actually happens. And that is that USCIS will respond to the subpoena and say, under a federal case called the Tuffy decision, we, USCIS, don't need to provide the affidavit to the plaintiff because they can get that material a different way, which is via the Freedom of Information Act. Now, that's kind of an iffy proposition on the part of the government, because part of the problem with FOIA, as I had just mentioned, is that the material can come back partially redacted. So I think if you ever really needed to get into a fight with the government in a situation where the affidavit came back redacted and CIS was refusing to respond to a subpoena, I think that's a fight the plaintiff could win, because you could say, look, government, you're redacting our FOIA request and at the same time denying our subpoena. You can't do both of those things. I will say that I have never had this seriously delay or hamper one of my affidavit of support cases. And the way that we do it in almost all of our cases is that we get the affidavit through the FOIA request. That provides us everything we need, no problem. The other route, aside from FOIA requests, that you can use, and this is something we do in time-sensitive cases, is use an expert witness to demonstrate to the court that the affidavit of support was signed. Let me describe how this would work. So in some affidavit of support cases, there is a real pressing need for financial support. Remember that the core obligation of the sponsor is simply to raise the sponsored immigrant's income just above the poverty guideline, 125%. So these are folks, the would-be plaintiffs of the world, the people who have rights that need to be enforced under the affidavit, who are typically in pretty serious financial trouble. And it's pretty common for clients of mine to be living in shelters. I have somebody who's homeless right now. These are people who can't wait 45 days for a FOIA request to come back. So one thing you can do in those urgent situations is pull in an outside expert. I use immigration colleague friends of mine for this purposes. And in a situation where you have somebody, I'll use a simple example of an IR1 visa where the spouse petitioned for the foreign spouse that's designated on the status denoted on the person's green card. So from the green card, we know that the US citizen spouse was the petitioner. We know by operation of US immigration law that the affidavit of support had to have been signed in that case, because if it had not been signed, USCIS or Department of State would not have had the legal authority to grant status to that person. So we can pull in an outside expert to write a declaration for a judge and say, look, judge, there is no way that the plaintiff in this action could have the immigration status that she has unless the affidavit of support sponsor / petitioner had signed the affidavit of support, because it would have been literally unlawful for the government to grant the status that we have here. That's a strategy that we've used a number of times successfully. It's something we've done sometimes when we're filing a preliminary injunction to try to get immediate financial support going as a lawsuit is progressing through the litigation process. The downside, of course, is that it's more cumbersome and expensive to deal with an outside expert than it is to simply take 15 minutes and file a Freedom of Information Act request online. That's easier. But in situations where time is really of the essence and it's really important to get into court fast, get the matter before the judge fast, and get an injunction so that support can start flowing, that's a situation where an expert witness is a really helpful tool to establish the fact that the affidavit of support was signed. Bottom line here is that certainly if you're a beneficiary of an affidavit of support and you know it, don't let the fact that you don't have a copy of the document prevent you from vindicating your rights under that contract. If you are the beneficiary of an affidavit of support, you have a legal right to have your income maintained at or above 125% of the poverty guideline during the sponsorship period. And don't let frustrations over access to paperwork prevent you from enforcing those rights. If you have any questions about this, I will try to link to material about how to request the affidavit via Freedom of Information Act request. If you have questions, feel free to drop them into the comments. If you would like us to take a confidential look at your potential case under the affidavit of support, reach out to us on our website. We offer free video consultations all around the United States, and have enforced the Affidavit of Support in many, many different federal courts all over the US. Hope this is helpful, and everyone have a nice day.